is a federal carbon tax the most effective way to slash emissions, or are there other programs that the federal government should have considered? Joining us from Calgary, Kenneth Green is the Energy and Environment Chair with the Fraser Institute. And with me here in studio, Chris Ragan is the Chair of Canada's Eco-Fiscal Commission. Hi to both of you. Wonderful to see you. Thanks for coming
nice
in.
To be here.
Mr. Ragan, I'll start with you. The claim that we've been hearing from the opposition is that this will make life more expensive. Will it?
Well, as your fact at the beginning laid out very nicely, it will make some things more expensive, but it's not going to make life more expensive. So the whole logic of a carbon price is that it makes carbon-intensive things more expensive so that households and small businesses and large businesses switch away over time and do things differently. But at the same time, those revenues that are raised by this federal carbon tax, 90% of them are going back to household rebates. You saw the values there in the introduction. And so for most households, and certainly for the typical household, they're going to get more back in a tax rebate than they actually spend in the carbon tax.
Does that hurt how much of an incentive it is then?
No. So this is a not very well communicated part of this policy, is that the whole logic of a carbon price is to do what in economic terms we would say change relative prices. So you think differently about the way that you spend money on carbon-intensive things. You think about driving, you think about heating, you think about vacations, but you get the money back in a tax rebate that you can spend on anything. So the price impact here is that it makes you change your behavior over time. Nothing's going to happen overnight. But the cash rebate means that it maintains your purchasing power. So life doesn't get more expensive, but some things get more expensive.
Okay, Mr. Green, same question to you. Does life get more expensive with this?
Certainly many aspects of life will get more expensive with this, because what Chris didn't say is that the household will get the rebates, and large emitters are going to get some of the remaining 10% that is not rebated in lump sums. But the lower and smaller and mid-sized businesses that people patronize every day for their groceries, go to a restaurant, buy clothing at the mall, all of those stores are going to be getting a carbon price without a rebate. That means they're going to have to do their best to pass on their costs to their consumers to as big an extent possible, and also to seek ways of cutting costs. That may mean lower quality goods and services, or it may just mean you get smaller portions when you go to the restaurant. But there will be an impact of imposing the tax. What it won't do is it won't significantly reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We know that people's demand for energy is so high you would need a tax literally upwards of $300 to $500 to actually make the changes necessary to make serious reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. And even then, you wouldn't be able to measure the effect on climate change because Canada is such a small source of emissions to begin with. So this is a virtue signaling act, a virtue signaling tax. It really will not yield a significant environmental benefit. It will raise costs on Canadians and affect their choices to a certain extent. And because it does not offset other economically distortionary taxes like the personal income tax or the corporate income tax, it will act as a general drag on the Canadian economy, because it's only by lowering those distortionary taxes that you can ease the impact of imposing the new carbon tax.
Okay, Mr. Ragan, let me bring you in because I want to ask you about that effectiveness question. Yeah. I'm glad Mr. Green brought it up. The contention that this is, that basically it is somewhat effective, and that's not his word, but it won't do what it says it will do. In fact, in order to accomplish that, you would need to bring in a much higher carbon tax.
Well, what a carbon price will do, and what it has done elsewhere, is reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Now, this $20 per ton carbon price is not going to reduce all of the emissions that we want to reduce by 2030 by tomorrow morning. It won't do that. This is a policy that is designed, this is at the beginning of this policy, as your introduction said, and this is a policy that we should be thinking about over decades, because this is a problem that we've got to solve over decades. So, but when we look at BC's carbon tax, Quebec's cap and trade system, California's system, the UK's system, these countries have, or these jurisdictions have put carbon prices in place, some of them for over 10 years. They have reduced greenhouse gas emissions from where they otherwise would have been, you mean in the absence of the tax, and those economies have been very strong. So this does work.
What about the idea, when you say looking at it over decades, that that price will have to rise substantially?
So,
do you agree with that?
Well, so here there's a really important policy decision. So the current federal, what's called the federal backstop, the one that's going in place today, is scheduled to rise to $50 per ton by 2022, and there's no plan yet to raise that. Now, I would love to see that carbon price go up by $10 per ton per year and hit something like $130, but then you could use those revenues to either give back to people, or you could use those revenues, as Ken said, to reduce income taxes or to reduce corporate income taxes. I think he is quite right that there is a benefit to be had if you use these revenues to recycle back to the economy, in particular to reduce income taxes, corporate or personal. But notice that 90% of these revenues from the federal carbon price are in fact going back. It's not called a tax reduction, it's a tax rebate. But to most people, that's pretty much the same.
Mr. Green, if pricing carbon or taxing carbon isn't the best policy, isn't the most effective policy, as you said, what would be?
Well, I think we've learned now from experiments around the world that trying to bring down greenhouse gas emissions is extremely costly and difficult. And we really don't have the technologies to do it at any meaningful scale while keeping electricity prices affordable for people around the world. So I think first and foremost, the government needs to increase sharply the amount of fundamental research and development spending it does in Canadian universities and research centers to find better ways to generate energy which lower emissions and lower costs instead of what we have now, which is wind and solar power, which increases costs tremendously. I think on top of that, there are many things we could do to actually reduce the impacts we're expecting from climate change that are outside of the entire tax framework. Things like hardening our infrastructure against floods and droughts, increasing our use of market pricing to regulate infrastructure, to maintain infrastructure. So we have a revenue flow, and if we need to raise a roadbed, we can do it. I think there's a lot of things that can be done prior to trying to force down greenhouse gas emissions. One thing that could be done easily, and has been done in the United States, which is one of the only countries to actually reach its targets, is to facilitate a move to natural gas from coal, and do that by actually giving tax incentives. So you tell somebody if you retrofit a coal plant, you can immediately depreciate the cost, and your product will be exempt from taxes for a certain period of time. That drives the move without the government having to say you're shutting down prematurely. And that movement to gas cuts a third to a half of your emissions compared to coal very quickly. The U.S. did that over only about 5 to 10 years.
Mr. Ragan, final word to you. Especially maybe if I could ask you about the idea that the idea of the cost associated, that it's so expensive to try and reduce.
Well, the reason, so if we take climate change seriously, and I think we should, and then the goal is not just to deal with adaptation and not just to do research, although I'm in favor of those things, but to actually start reducing greenhouse gas emissions now. So the choices on the table are you do something that looks an awful lot like a carbon price, or you do something that looks an awful lot like quite intrusive, fairly complicated regulations, typically sector by sector. The reason why the Ecofiscal Commission and every economist I know likes a carbon price as the preferred method is that it is the lowest cost way to do it. And coming back to what Ken said, if you use the revenues to recycle back into the economy, you can actually get the benefits of reduced emissions environmentally, but also the economic benefits that come from lower personal and corporate income taxes. But the carbon price, I know of no way to reduce emissions that is lower cost than a carbon price. And if we care about economic performance,
if that's what where your priorities are.
But if you care about economic performance, I think the responsibility is to try to use the cheapest way to do it. Now, there's a debate about whether a carbon price is politically feasible or not. I'm not a political expert, so I won't make comment on that. But if we care about both the environment and the economy, then let's use the lowest price way to do it.
All right, I'll leave it there. I appreciate both your perspectives very much this evening.
Thank you.
Thanks to Ken Green and Chris Ragan.